It's the barrier of Provence, guardian of a titanic natural entryway. Perched on its rocky outcrop, overlooking an incline of over 100 meters, the Citadel of Sisteron emerges from the cliff.
Looking at it from a distance, you have the impression that it's a geological outgrowth in itself.
The Citadel of Sisteron is truly vertiginous.
There are other citadels on mountains, of course, but I don't know of any other cut in two by an existing rocky ridge.
Extending more than 30,000 square meters, the Citadel of Sisteron is a jewel that turned obstacles into assets to protect a major strategic site.
The narrow Durance Valley was the crucial point that had to be controlled. Sisteron was hence a high-stakes location.
What challenges did the builders face in taming the rock?
The stonemasons were dealing with a base that was too narrow, so they had to build walls on every side in order to enlarge it.
They transformed the steep slopes into colossal nested platforms to create 1,600 meters of angular fortification.
The masses of dirt carried were absolutely huge. They created these large terraces that required thousands of cubic meters of soil to be transported.
Discover the technological breakthroughs that led to the creation of the Citadel of Sisteron as you travel through nearly 600 years of the evolution of fortification. From the high towers of the Middle Ages,
clearly these beautiful vertical perimeter towers were ideal targets for artillery,
to the improbable underground stairways of the 19th century.
At a time when people worked with crowbars and black powder, it was already quite a feat to dig this type of staircase in the rock.
By way of the colossal plans of the legendary Vauban and the bastions of the Renaissance.
No matter where you attacked a stronghold, you were always under fire from several angles.
By penetrating the many facets of the Citadel, we will discover a unique site where nature and man worked in concert to shape a marvel of military architecture. The beginning of this architectural adventure began with an exceptional natural site, a rocky outcrop that stretched from east to west, with the promontory of the Citadel on one side and the impressive Rocher de la Baume on the other. A wall pierced with a geological rarity that imprinted its unique silhouette on the landscape and gave it a singular feature, a gorge.
The most striking thing about the natural site of Sisteron is the gorge, the narrow valley dug perpendicularly by the river into the rock. Had the river had common sense, it would have gone around the obstacle instead of straight through it, right into the mountain. It's quite remarkable.
This breach was the most traversable access to connect two major territories, the Alps and Provence. It was indeed possible to get across by following the river. Barely a few dozen meters wide, this narrow passage was the site's first asset.
It was a bottleneck for traffic coming from Provence, as well as from the Alps. It forced all the land trips, and therefore land trade, to pass through this location.
The rocky ridge wasn't the only natural obstacle that cut the entire region in half. The other was the Durance itself, a dangerous and unpredictable river. Throughout its course, no bridge resisted. But once again, Sisteron was an exception.
Many attempts to build bridges failed because when a torrent like the Durance overflows, the material at the bottom of the riverbed starts to move over several meters. It's not just water flowing on a bed of pebbles. The entire mass of water-soaked pebbles vibrates, moves, and collides.
Inserting pillars at such depths was challenging. If the builders multiplied them to try to stabilize the edifice, they were faced with a double problem. First, the water pressure on the bridge increases because the submerged surfaces are enlarged. Second, since the arches are reduced, debris carried by the river can block it and generate fatal extra pressure on the bridge. Until the 19th century, the problem remained unsolvable, except in one place.
Sisteron is in a privileged location. Because of the gorge, they were able to build a bridge on two stone banks, which resisted for centuries. at least since the Middle Ages. It's the only place where a hard stone bridge was built that can be crossed regardless of the weather.
Sisteron was therefore in a major strategic position, one that is quite exceptional when you add its final decisive asset, the rocky outcrop where the citadel sits today.
The rock of the citadel was like the bolt of the door to the gorge. That's really it. It was a lock with a peephole that allowed the monitoring of both sides. This high position made it possible to control the surroundings. In fact, you only have to climb to the top of the citadel to realize that you can see for kilometers around and ensure a defensive position on the city below.
The city represented a commercial crossroads that had the power to completely shut down access to Provence at any time. The roots of the citadel were anchored in this strategic position, which the city had been growing since Roman times. Surprisingly, the importance of the ancient city was revealed by necropolises. More than the remains of everyday life, it was the discoveries of several mausoleums, some richly decorated, that brought valuable teachings to archaeologists.
From these discoveries of necropolises, we could circumscribe the area that was reserved for the dead and that which was reserved for the living. Because in Roman times, the city itself was a sacred space, the pomerium, and it was forbidden to cremate or bury anyone inside. So, by dint of collecting new pieces of the puzzle, we were able to place the inhabitants in South Sisteron and to determine that the city limits must have existed in that area.
It was an extensive and important city, as evidenced by its presence on Roman maps. Sisteron thrived within this Pax Romana thanks to its strategic position on the Via Domitia, the ancient road connecting Italy to Spain. But the fall of the Roman Empire in the Middle Ages turned Sisteron into a territorial border.
In the Middle Ages, the danger came mainly from the north. Sisteron served as a border for both the county of Forcalquier and later for the county of Provence, making it the focus of all defensive efforts.
Naturally, this defense revolved around the highest point of the site, the rocky outcrop.
The part of the rock on which the city leans on the south side wasn't too steep or too high to be occupied by a castle. It was the castle of the Counts of Forcalquier and the Counts of Provence that was the first erected on this rocky ridge.
Only a few meters of walls remain of this castle, along with a typically medieval padded door. Almost nothing, and for good reason. It was destroyed around 1250 by the inhabitants of Sisteron, revolting against the nobles in power. Throughout history, clashes between this independent population and the rulers multiplied and shaped the face of the fortifications of Sisteron. This tug of war gave birth to the citadel, but at the end of the 13th century, the inhabitants of Sisteron marked their territory.
This city had its autonomy. It was administered by councils and didn't want to lose any of its independence. So it was the city of Sisteron itself that ensured the defense of the site.
There was an urgent need to build a defense worthy of the name, as by the 14th century, danger was drawing closer. The 100 Years' War raged in the powerful neighboring Kingdom of France. At the gates of the conflict, the entire county of Provence and its border town of Sisteron lived under the terrible threat of the mercenaries hired by the King of France to fight the British.
The mercenaries, waging the 100 Years' War, were military art professionals, paid for their services. When they weren't fighting, these mercenaries needed resources, and in order to get them, they pillaged outside the Kingdom of France.
An incredible collective psychosis developed in all these Provençal cities, which resulted in the development of security plans with gigantic budgets. Phenomenal enclosures were built, and one of the most emblematic and most spectacular was that of Sisteron.
Enclosing the city against the rock, a powerful wall was erected. It measured more than a kilometer long, reaching 10 meters in height in places. It was lined with deep ditches. 9 monumental towers were distributed around this impassable barrier. Semicircular in shape, each extended over 20 meters, the equivalent of a 7-story building. In the event of an attack, the entire surrounding population could retreat to the shelter of this enclosure. The entrance to the city was regulated by the 2 imposing 15-meter-high main gates, located to the north and south of the city. The north gate, known as Porte de la Saunerie, also aimed at controlling the eminently strategic access to the Durance Bridge. At the top of this enclosure, protecting the northern border of the city, the wall was built on a particularly steep part of the rock. The builders showed prowess in erecting this walkway on such a vertiginous site.
The Citadel of Sisteron is truly vertiginous because the 14th century walls surrounding the city defied the laws of gravity.
Looking at it from a distance, it appears to be a geological outgrowth in and of itself. The reason they erected it like that, above the void, is because the limestone was very compact and solid, making it stable enough.
Even with hard rock to support the structure, the challenge seemed colossal, because the rocky stop was irregular and narrowed at the top. How could a wall be built on a summit so thin in places?
Stonemasons were dealing with a base that was too narrow, so they had to build walls on every side in the north and the south in order to enlarge it.
The foundation of the walls was cut on both sides of the outcrop in the form of a staircase, so as to create perfectly horizontal steps on which to lay the first stones. Their importance was paramount. They had to transfer all the weight of the wall to the rock without being destabilized. Once these foundations were laid, the assembly of the walls began. It required huge quantities of stones, most likely from the nearby quarries of Chambranson. Another much more expected natural resource was also used extensively: wood.
Construction sites required a lot of wood. Very large amounts of struts and scaffolding that were anchored into the rock. The idea was to create platforms to ensure the stability of the masons so they could mount the walls from the outside.
The platforms were gradually raised as the wall was built several dozen meters above the void. The wall walk thus built is exceptional. For over 140 meters, it follows the winding route of the rocky stop. From the top of the promontory, one can see up to 150 kilometers away. At the end of this wall protecting the entrance to Provence, a large chapel was built at the same time. But its construction raises a question. Why did they decide to erect a religious building at the most strategic place of the site from where they could monitor the bridge below?
In any city encompassing a high point, such a place is always first occupied by a sanctuary. They magnified the place closest to the divinity, and it was therefore a preventative, protective measure to install a chapel on the highest point.
It represented a very strong architectural sign in the landscape. On the Dauphiné side, before one could see the city or discover that a city even existed behind this rocky ridge, this large chapel and tower existed from the 14th century onward.
But how did the builders manage to erect a church almost 10 meters wide on a ridge so narrow that it struggled to hold a 1-meter-thick rampart? It was impossible to use the same technique as for the wall walk. A closer look at the chapel, restored to its original shape in the 20th century, reveals that it's asymmetric. The walls on the south side are taller than on the north side. This clue explains the structure of the foundations.
The chapel leans against the rocky spine, which itself has carried the wall of the city since the 14th century. The problem was that they couldn't use explosives to dig, because that stone was too fractured and it would create microcracks that would break it up. They were forced to use a crowbar and go down little by little to create this large tread that made it possible to embed the chapel into the rock.
A considerable job. The resulting platform measured more than 200 square meters, the equivalent of a tennis court. In some places, the rock had to be dug over a height of 5 meters to achieve such a surface.
This explains why it doesn't have a window to the north, since they created this vaulted space that's anchored into the rocky spine.
From inside the chapel, one can see the impacts of the tool in the rock. In certain areas, the foundations of the vault rest directly on the rock. The chapel thus completed the walls of the city, which then covered an area of about 12 hectares. To defend this considerable enclosure, the locals counted on powerful towers of remarkable but borderline disproportionate height.
Why are these towers so high? That's a valid question. Was it really necessary? Especially since the perimeter wall between the tower is much lower, only a third of the height of the towers. This was an era when defense heavily relied on big crossbows. And in order for these large crossbows to be efficient at long range, the shooting position needed to have a certain altitude.
These crossbows had a 6-meter wingspan. Maneuvering them required 12 men. They could launch a 2-meter arrow some 150 to 200 meters away. They represented extraordinarily powerful weapons of war. These towers were specifically built to serve as shooting platforms.
The long-range defense was provided by giant crossbows. For short-range defense, the towers were equipped with 2 levels of crossbows. These slits for aiming have a characteristic shape called a quapati. They were also a strong rallying symbol of Christianity. Add to that the defensive innovation that every large enclosure had to have. A stone balcony with vertical openings called a machicolation.
There's a kind of folk mythology in which people believe that boiling oil was thrown through the machicolations. Of course, they didn't have the means to waste so much oil. It's a legend. In reality, projectiles or stones were thrown at possible attackers who reached the foot of the walls and pressed up against them to try to defend themselves from the archers' shots.
Completed at the end of the 14th century, Sisteron's imposing enclosure extended on an area equivalent to 20 soccer fields. At the time, Sisteron was the major city in northern Provence.
The towers of the 14th century were meant to show the importance of the city, its prestige and its strength. They were also meant to scare by showing that the city was impregnable. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages, Sisteron was never taken.
The high walls of Sisteron underwent the test of fire during the Wars of Religion. Once again, under the rule of the King of France, Provence and the rest of the kingdom fell prey to violent fratricidal confrontations in the second half of the 16th century. Sisteron became a place of refuge for Protestants. In January 1562, the king's Catholic troops decided to attack to regain control of the city. The assault, led by 3 batteries of cannons distributed around the ramparts, was particularly violent.
They realized that these beautiful vertical perimeter towers were ideal targets for artillery. From the moment cannons with metal balls were used, they became totally fragile, vulnerable elements. It was very easy for siege artillery to make breaches in such walls, to break down city gates and certain parts of the enclosure. The height of the towers no longer served much purpose. This enclosure was obsolete from a defensive point of view.
The Protestants did have a few cannons to fight back, but the platforms created 2 centuries earlier for crossbows couldn't support their weight. They were forced to find a makeshift solution.
During the Catholic siege of Sisteron, the cathedral church was used as cannon firing range. The Protestants mounted cannons to fire on the Catholic armies besieging the city.
The metal cannonballs were far too powerful an opponent for the city walls. Sisteron eventually surrendered to the king's armies. Fractured and worn out, just like France, the defense of the city had to be completely revamped at the end of the Wars of Religion. The royal power imagined a new project that would allow it to establish its domination: the creation of a citadel.
A citadel is a fort, so to speak, that controls a city and which is built on the outskirts, preferably on a high point, to typographically control the site as a whole, both outside and inside the city. It's an establishment that allows for permanent control.
Straddled on the medieval walls of the city on either side of the wall walk, such a citadel could house a permanent garrison while remaining independent of the city. The king would have on hand the strike force necessary to protect the city, but also to prevent any rebellion. In the aftermath of the Protestant insurrection, this solution seemed ideal.
You can clearly see the symbolic aspect of this construction. At the same time the citadel was built, the royal power asserted itself. This was the construction of France. The king built his citadel to really implant his power, leaving no choice to the local power other than submit.
But the most difficult thing remained: to tackle the many construction challenges one by one and transform this project into a real fortress and honor the will of the king. As a symbol of this seizure of power, in 1589 the chapel became the starting point of the Citadel project. Notre-Dame de Château was deconsecrated and converted into a military building. 2 floors of 3 rooms each saw the day. The building then housed the highest authority of the Citadel, the King's Lieutenant. To access these new rooms, an entrance on the side of the building had to be created. But the south wall overlooked a cliff more than 20 meters high. In response to this first challenge, the builders created a thin platform on the side of the chapel. It was carried by 6 arches pressed against the rock, each resting on massive 17-meter pillars. To put together this impressive series of vaults, they used the highly effective technique of bending.
To constitute a semicircular arch, they first needed to build its form out of wood. They need 2 bearings that are called springers, which are the first archstones that will shape the arch. There they installed a horizontal beam on which they constructed the shape of the arch in a semicircle. Then they installed formwork boards, which then received the keystones. Since they used lime in their masonry work, when the lime dried, it retracted. As a result, it separated from the formwork, making it very easy to disassemble the forms.
The builders did the same to widen the wall walk. This line of arches would become the aesthetic signature of the citadel. But the most important challenge remained to be addressed: how to build a fortress that would resist cannonballs better than the walls and towers of the city. Such was the major challenge faced by all the strongholds and the greatest strategists in the 16th century, starting with the Italians during the great Transalpine campaigns of the kings of France at the beginning of the century.
Machiavelli spoke of a terrible trauma in Italy, which he dubbed the French Fury. These were the French cannons that burst into Italy and brought down huge ornamented brick castles like a house of cards. This galvanized the search to find an answer that turned out to be the bastion system first conceived in the 1530s.
The genesis of the bastion system was to replace the towers and walls with lower elements that were filled with earth. This structure is more resistant to cannon fire because the earth absorbs the shock of the cannonballs. The shapes widened considerably, becoming squat and angular. Towers became bastions, walls became ramparts. Defense was no longer vertical, it became horizontal. To better understand this architectural revolution that gave rise to the Citadel of Sisteron, a detour to the Alps is in order. At the top of a hill overlooking the Isère Valley, a fortress was built at the same time as the citadel that perfectly represented the new Italian principles of bastion fortification. Fort Barreau.
The fundamental principle of star-shaped forts, or Italian layout, consists in forts that aren't high, but at ground level and surrounded by a huge protective sloping bank that hides the fort from the sight of the enemy. From a kilometer away, the fort isn't visible. On a plain, a bastion site is practically invisible.
The fort was protected by a wide moat and a gentle slope called the glacis, so that the ramparts couldn't be hit directly by enemy fire. This also made it possible to shoot horizontally to repel the attackers as far away as possible. The angular shapes of the bastions offered 2 firing positions, one for distant fire and one to protect the neighboring stronghold if the enemy managed to approach it. This is called reciprocal flanking, the ability of strongholds to protect each other.
A star-shaped fort has no blind spot. No matter where you attack a bastion's fort, there will always be two cannons firing at you. You're under the constant crossfire of several defenders. A bastion fort implies a concerted defense where the bastions support each other. Hence the reason why the engineers of the Renaissance insisted on the fact that a fortress was like a human body. The pentagon with a head and four members represented the solidarity of all these members in the collective defense.
A worthy representative of the Italian school at the origin of bastion forms, engineer Ercole Negro realized an almost ideal layout in Barreau, barely constrained by the somewhat elongated shape of the site. In Sisteron, the task seemed much more complex for French engineer Gérin Sarrazin, most likely a student of Ercole Negro. While his master had a hill he could shape as he pleased, Sarrazin had to deal with a real mountain that needed to be tamed.
You couldn't have the same star shape in Sisteron because the site was on a rocky outcrop, which obviously forces to build on the very shape of that outcrop.
They needed to set up bastions, which is very hard to do on a constraining site such as that of the Citadel, especially with this rocky ridge that they chose to envelop with enclosure.
The outer layout of the Citadel covered an area of more than 3 hectares, the equivalent of 5 soccer fields. In the southern part facing the city, Sarrazin managed to handle the terrain and established 2 bastions that could protect each other. The northern part, located on the other side of the rocky ridge, also featured 2 bastions that faced each other.
What's quite magnificent and a show of intelligence and brilliant architecture is that he managed to design bastions that were perfectly flanked on such a constrained area.
Sarrazin planned the layout in such a way that each area surrounding the citadel would be protected. Should the enemy manage to approach at the foot of the ramparts, they would likely have no blind spot to hide. But the task wasn't finished because in Sisteron, unlike Barreau and other fortresses in the plains, the citadel couldn't be hidden from the sight of the enemy behind a ditch. They had to use the mountain to their advantage. Those who can't hide must dominate. On the city side in the steep slope, Sarrazin therefore planned to build stacked platforms leading to the top of the citadel.
There were potentially 3 levels of the Citadel of Sisteron on which they could set up artillery batteries overlapping each other.
Thanks to these ever higher firing positions, they could shoot farther, thus pushing back the enemy to distances where their guns would no longer be effective. Defense turned into offense. But how to build such terraces on a slope so steep that it climbs the equivalent of a 15-story building in just 100 meters? First, they had to dig the rock to create a flat base to raise the walls. They were composed of 2 layers of stone separated by a looser layer to better absorb the impact of the cannonballs. The walls measured an impressive 2.5 meters wide and were inclined to prevent them from collapsing due to the thrust of the soil they held. Every 5 meters, they were consolidated on the inner side by powerful buttresses. Every 5 buttresses, a breach was left in the rampart in order to carry the earth that would form the platform.
The main problem of a site like this one is finding soil. The masses of dirt carried were absolutely huge. They created these large terraces that required thousands of cubic meters of soil to be transported. They couldn't take sand from the Durance since it was too volatile. They needed loose soil, cropland, so it was taken from the agricultural plain.
The other construction issue was drainage. In the mountains, the water that seeps in can freeze, creating fatal damage to the construction. The base of the walls was therefore pierced with openings called weep holes in order to evacuate as much water as possible. The geological nature of the rock also proved to be a valuable ally.
In the case of the Citadel of Sisteron, it helped that the layers were vertical, that the limestone was a bit fractured, and that the interbeds between the layers and the fractures of layers themselves were like natural drains that led the water deep down. They used a geological phenomenon to their advantage.
Started in 1589, the construction lasted more than 20 years. Engineers Raymond and Jean de Bonfons led the majority of the work and created a citadel faithful to Sarrazin's idea. a citadel of impressive proportions and complex shapes. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable result of this construction could surprisingly be revealed by a simple bubble level.
One of the successes of the military engineers of the 16th and early 17th centuries who built Sisteron on an extremely chaotic site is the horizontal leveling of the main bastion fronts. There's not a single bastion that's significantly lower than the others.
In order for the two bastions on the same platform to effectively protect each other, they had to be built at the same height. If one stronghold was higher than the other, then in the event of an enemy attack, the aggressors would be safe from cannon fire that would pass over their heads. The perfect horizontality of each platform was therefore essential to an efficient defense.
It's amazing to think that the engineer designed platforms in successive horizontalities in an era when citadels were designed without relief plans, without three-dimensional models of the object being designed. It's a major example of adaptation to the terrain with a great economy of means.
The platforms stacked on one another, so distinctive of the silhouette of the citadel, also had another interest. Like Russian dolls, they formed several enclosures nested in each other.
In Sisteron, there was a layering of enclosures that also constituted an entrenchment of these enclosures in relation to one another. If the enemy got a foothold in the first enclosure, the second enclosure could always defend itself, followed by the shooters on the rocky ridge itself who could fire from up high.
A classic citadel, or a typical one, doesn't feature any interlocking or successive enclosures. There's just a single enclosure with bastion fronts, which is as regular as possible. So Sisteron is very original in that sense.
This was a rarity for a bastion citadel, which at first glance seemed to be an additional asset, for even if the enemy managed to enter, the site would not be totally lost.
It may have had a defensive interest, but it was an outrageous fragmentation of traffic that complicated the defense, because each time they had to open numerous bridges. That could handicap the enemy, but also the internal circulation of the defensive forces.
Efficient traffic was crucial to bastion fortresses, as they were often under-equipped in terms of cannons. Not all firing positions were constantly occupied by artillery, so they had to move these guns, each weighing nearly 1.5 tons. The stairs and doors leading to the successive enclosures would become insurmountable obstacles. There was another obstacle to the free movement of men and cannons: the rocky ridge itself, on which the wall walk sits.
The very particular rocky ridge which cuts the citadel in two seems to be a constraint at first. Why did they build two partition parts? It was impractical, but it was also an advantage. How? Precisely because the northern part could be completely independent defensively, especially from access through the city, and the city was totally unaware of what was happening on the north side.
For a citadel to work, it had to be a getaway, meaning both a door to the city, but also, and above all, a door to the countryside, which allowed, unbeknownst to the city, to bring troops in or even flee if necessary. In Sisteron, this central rocky backbone was the perfect reflection of this dichotomy between a city side and a countryside.
A two-sided fortress. This was the very essence of what led the royal power to create the citadel. To protect the city, certainly, but also to monitor it in the event of an insurrection, as during the wars of religion. Nevertheless, they needed to be able to go from one side of the citadel to the other. Two openings were therefore created through the rocky ridge. The first, originally designed to be a simple gun port, was located at the end of the wall walk. It was pierced in the thinnest part of the ridge. The larger other opening was located in the center of the ridge and particularly difficult to achieve. A 20-meter-long staircase was dug into the rock. It led to a platform defending the passage. This work, called a tambour, was not of crucial importance to the defense. However, engineer Jean de Bonfons insisted on perfectionism to the point of giving it perfect angular lines characteristic of bastioned fortification.
You can't reduce the interpretation of the Citadel of Sisteron to a strictly functionalist, rationalist spirit. There was always a dimension of prestige and an aesthetic one as well. At that time, engineers were also architects, and they were concerned with harmony, balance, and shape aesthetics. For example, the small gatehouse or watchtowers featured at the tip of the bastions. There's one at the Citadel of Sisteron that's very beautiful, polygonal, and entirely made of cut stone. It was completely useless to take such care in achieving it, but it's part of a component of which they never lost sight, namely that their works had to be strong and beautiful.
Jean Sarrazin and his successors managed to overcome the constraints and leave pure pragmatism behind. Here too, the search for beauty and form struck a chord. The citadel finally seemed ready. Henry IV is said to have declared that it was the most powerful fortress in his kingdom. However, less than 100 years later, another great man scrutinized it with a critical eye to try to put his mark on it. Vauban, Louis XIV's famous Commissioner General of Fortifications.
Vauban's arrival was the result of the trauma experienced by the French armies during the invasion of the Savoyard troops of Victor Amédée in the summer of 1692.
An army of 40,000 men invaded and devastated the entire region, stopping a few dozen kilometers north of Sisteron. When the army withdrew to avoid being trapped for winter, it took 20,000 head of cattle and left the area completely drained in the wake of the raid. There was an urgent need to review the defense of the Alps, of which Sisteron was a part. Vauban carried out his mission with all the intransigence that characterized him.
Vauban was a man who moved fast and was extremely observant. He read a lot before he arrived. He used to form opinions very quickly, and he was rarely wrong.
In his report, Vauban highlighted the exceptional strategic quality of the site on which the citadel was located, a barrier commanding the entire Durance Valley, which could be defended by a small number of men. But according to him, it was a fortress with an Achilles heel.
The main weak point of the citadel was the surrounding heights that dominated it to the west, from which enemy artillery could fire on the fort. On the western front, the project was sizable, since it encompassed the creation of a half-bastion, the regularization of the ditch, the creation of a lunette in front of the curtain wall with its own ditch, and finally, the setup of a glacis in front of the lunette.
But that wasn't all. Vauban also proposed the creation of new works outside the citadel. Two small forts located on the surrounding hills slightly overlooking the fortress.
In mountain fortification, they say that he who holds the highs holds the lows. That means that if you leave a hill exposed that's higher than you or your fort, you must put an outpost on top, otherwise the enemy will use that space to fire on you.
Thanks to the forts and modifications of the Western Front, the entire area would need to be protected. But this project was colossal. The lunette was a structure that needed to accommodate cannons in order to protect the first rampart of the citadel. It was therefore essential for it to be perfectly horizontal. However, the natural slope was very steep here, creating a problematic difference in altitude. Considerable amounts of soil would have to be moved to create a glacis that resolved this difference in altitude and protected the lunette. The entire hill had to be moved. This was just one of the problems that undermined the project.
All of Vauban's proposals fell on deaf ears, because he made his assessment so quickly that he didn't realize how hard the rock was that needed to be moved, which would have made the costs of that isolating ditch prohibitively high. He didn't measure the impact of his concept.
In the end of Vauban's ambitious plan, only one detail was achieved: the creation of a new powder magazine, a detail Vauban nevertheless made his priority. The powders were previously stored in a small room in the middle of the citadel, an absolute hearsay considering the damage an explosion would have caused.
The powder magazine had to be in an area of the citadel where there were no barracks for troops that would have been vulnerable in the event of an explosion. That's why Vauban proposed placing it in the most central part of the northern enclosure that hadn't yet been built up.
Vauban designed a magazine with two superimposed vaulted rooms, one of which was in the basement. A building of modest exterior appearance, but which actually provided ingenious technical solutions to very particular constraints.
He was forced to design a powder magazine that kept the powders dry, since the enemy of powder is moisture. But he also had to protect the powders against anyone who could throw a match in there. So they needed very thick walls and ventilation. That was the contradiction.
To ensure safe ventilation, Vauban decided on baffle vents, which only allowed air to pass through. The walls were more than 2.6 meters thick. The much thinner vaults were built of bricks, so that in the event of an explosion, the blast would travel vertically and not horizontally in order to limit the damage. Following Vauban's passage in 1692, many military engineers proposed modifications to the citadel throughout the 18th century. Constantly postponed for lack of resources, none of these projects ever saw the light of day.
The Citadel of Sisteron lost its importance in the 18th century because the defense was moved farther upstream of the Durance Valley. The minute an area found itself far from the border, as the border eventually moved, they stopped modernizing it since its purpose was diminished. If a fortress isn't updated each time a more efficient type of armament emerges, which first benefits the attacker, it quickly becomes obsolete. It's the constant race between the projectile and the armor. This reciprocal relationship between ever more efficient weapons and the architectural defense response that always follows. So if a fortification isn't updated, which comes at a constant cost, it quickly goes out of date.
The citadel gradually fell into oblivion, but a totally unexpected event revealed its usefulness. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed in Provence from his forced exile from Elba, which he had left in secret a few days earlier. He sought to reach Paris to bring down Louis XVIII, accompanied by his personal guard of only 1,000 men, a very meager army to reconquer the throne.
When Napoleon landed at Golfe-Juan and decided to go through the Alps rather than through Provence, where he knew the population was hostile to him, his goal was to outpace his enemies. He chose this route to surprise the royalists and others who might stand in the way of his return.
In the early days of this bold gamble, which Napoleon sought to call the flight of the eagle, one particularly crucial point stood out: Sisteron.
Sisteron had everything necessary to stop Napoleon. All it would have taken to halt his progression was to destroy the only stone bridge over the Durance. On his heels were the troops of General Meaulis, who were far more numerous than those available to Napoleon at the time. That means the Citadel of Sisteron clearly had the means to put an end to the flight of the eagle.
Napoleon was worried. He sent Cambronne, his most faithful general, as a scout. In the middle of the night of March 4th, Cambronne entered Sisteron without any resistance and learned with relief that the citadel had been disarmed. It would allow the emperor to pass without a fight, a questionable decision on the part of the royal army troops.
Many of these men loved Napoleon. They were torn between the relatively new oath they had sworn to the king less than a year before and the weight of the remembrance and attachment some of them had felt for Napoleon for over 20 years.
L'attachement qu'ils ont pu concevoir pour Napoléon depuis, pour certains, plus de 20 ans.
Napoleon's stopover in Sisteron highlighted the strategic nature of the site. The historical context of the 19th century made it even more important. The growing power of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, supported by the Austrian Empire, posed a threat to the entire border of the Alps, a threat that led the citadel to a final unexpected innovation.
The threat grew, hence the rebirth of Sisteron's importance in the 1820s. The important point of Sisteron's position was the bridge over the Durance. The control over that bridge is what made the citadel and the city relevant.
But despite the location of the citadel, it was indeed the city walls, and in particular the north fortified gate, known as the Porte de la Saunerie, that had been tasked with defending the bridge until then.
La citadelle n'avait qu'une visibilité lointaine et
The visibility of the citadel over the bridge in the distance was limited and vertical. Paradoxically, only lookouts or men-at-arms with rifles could fire towards the bridge, which was useless. It was too far, too distant. There was no real control over the bridge.
There were only two solutions: either hold the city to hold the bridge, or find another way to hold the bridge without holding the city.
As the medieval walls of the city were totally obsolete, military engineers had no choice but to consider a link from the citadel. But how to connect it to the bridge located 100 meters below? The cliff's incline seemed totally impassable.
They would have had to build complicated external stairs and staggered constructions on the rock. Several strange and impractical projects were proposed.
They couldn't find a project that solved two problems: the connection between the citadel and the Porte de la Saunerie, as well as the protection of the staircase, which was under direct fire from the height of La Baume on the other side of the Durance.
The answer provided by the military engineers seemed unlikely: to dig an underground staircase through the rocky ridge starting from the Bastion de la Durance, located below the chapel, to the edge of the bridge 60 meters below, a difference in altitude equivalent to the first floor of the Eiffel Tower.
The digging of an underground staircase between the citadel and the Porte de la Saunerie appeared to be a colossal job. But in fact, it was the only military solution for creating a protective passage that couldn't be destroyed from the heights of La Baume.
It was wide yet narrow enough that they could drill openings to illuminate the staircase. It was really a tunneler's job, dug right into the rock.
Work began at the highest point in 1841. The section of the tunnel measured 3 meters, meaning that few men could work simultaneously.
According to a report from that year, approximately 1 meter was dug by 2 men every 12 days. At a time when they were still using crowbars and black powder, digging this type of staircase in the rock was no small feat.
It takes more energy to dig in hard rock, but the finished work is of better quality since it stays in place. No masonry is required for the vault to stand alone.
The tunnel was finally completed in 1844. It required 3 years of work. Around the same time, the amenities of the citadel were significantly revamped. New drawbridges were installed. Accesses were modified per Vauban's will to move the guns more easily, and buried barracks, casemates, and entrenchments were created to better protect the troops from enemy artillery. Thanks to these improvements, the citadel could house a garrison of 1,200 men and withstand a month-long siege, enough to hold off the enemy until a supporting army would arrive. In 1860, the citadel was finally complete and seemed at its peak. But in reality, a fortress is never finished, and the race against artillery it had been running since the Middle Ages was lost before it even began.
From 1880 on, chemical explosives were installed, which were much more powerful than the black powder that had been used until then. Sisteron's defenses were no longer able to resist these inventions. As a result, the citadel was abandoned.
The location was no longer suitable for the time. Its usefulness had also diminished. In recovering the Duchy of Savoy and the County of Nice, France pushed back its borders, and Sisteron was no longer of vital strategic importance to the country. In 1894, the citadel lost its raison d'être. It was militarily decommissioned. It was ultimately its grace and incredible fusion with the rock that gave it a piece of eternity. Attracted by its unique lines, 19th century painters from Turner to Signac would magnify it. theater lovers gave it a new life, taking advantage of the incredible decorum of the site to create a stage and a renowned theater festival during the interwar period. They even literally saved it. After terrible Allied bombing in August 1944, the Citadel was hollowed out. Its most emblematic building, the chapel, was totally destroyed by a bomb. Its restoration, which took nearly half a century, was only made possible thanks to the Nuit de la Citadelle festival and its organizers, the Arts, Theater, Monuments organization. It was no coincidence that art would ultimately save the Citadel, an object of defense that had become an object of contemplation.
It's part of the landscape in a secular way. It's inseparable from the landscape. When you arrive in Sisteron, you see the silhouette with the chapel keep and the belfry. And on the south side, these large arcades that support the chapel, which contribute to its aesthetic, along with the arcades of the surrounding wall on the left. It's an object of reverence, respect, and admiration on the part of visitors and the inhabitants of the city. It continues to exist as an historical monument and cultural landmark.
Survivor of the tumults of history, the Citadel of Sisteron is an unalterable lookout, much like the promontory it has occupied for so many centuries, an architectural link that unites the time of men and that of rocks.